Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to our Cal Poly LA Metro lecture series. Tonight we have some special guests, Michael Anderson and Frances Anderton, and our students from Cal Poly. So welcome, everyone. My name's Angela Anthony. I'm the Marketing and Communications Director for Helms Bakery District. For those of you who don't know about Helms, it's an actual, it's a landmark building built in 1931 when it was an actual working bakery. The Marx family purchased it in the early 70s and began this loving restoration and reimagining to what you see today, which is a collection of furniture showrooms, specialty shops, restaurants, and events, which is what we typically do, all art, architecture, and design events. So you can see the historic Helms Bakery sign behind me. Anyway, Frances and I are partnering in some wonderful events coming up, so stay tuned for those. And Stephen and I have been partnering for several years now with this lecture series. We're really excited. We're sad we're not in person, but hopefully soon. We're optimistic. So I'm going to turn it over to Stephen Phillips, who's our host for the evening. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And of course, Michael and Frances, we're really looking forward to this conversation and lecture and to see the work. Frances told me many things, so I'm super excited. My name is, of course, Stephen Phillips. I'm the director of the Cal Poly LA Metro program in architecture and urban design. We are off-campus program for Cal Poly San Luis Obispo here in Los Angeles. We've been here for over 10 years, 11 years. And we run this wonderful lecture series, which is a lot of fun here at the Helms, as Angela said. We have an event coming up on June 17th, so that will be live at the Helms. We're very excited about that, a big housing event. I would like to also just say thank you, of course, to the Helms Bakery District, HMC Architects, Morphosis, ARC Reprographics, AC Martin, Co-Architects, Theater DNA, Bultaup, and the AIA for supporting us. And with that, I'm just going to introduce our wonderful speakers. We will have a Q&A at the end, and you're all welcome to ask questions, and we'll manage that. I'll moderate that at the end. So we have Michael Anderson. There's Michael right there. Michael is a principal architect at Anderson Barker, an architecture urban economic development firm in Los Angeles. His expertise is transit stations, communities, aviation, civic, commercial, residential, and municipal infrastructure projects, such as streetscapes, parking structures, community centers, and parks. All the big work, very impressive. His focuses, he focuses to aid municipalities to modernize underserved communities and increase ownership, utilizing business strategies that are mutually beneficial to all parties. He's currently working on a pilot project for accelerated equity housing and transit-oriented communities, TOC solutions, to collaborating with public funding, private capital sources, and real estate development companies. Very esoteric part of the business, which is great that you understand it, because we architects don't. He is currently completing a book, Urban Magic, Vibrant Black and Brown Communities Are Possible. Anderson Barker's notable projects include LA Clippers Arena Plaza buildings and parking garages in Inglewood, Hollywood Park in Inglewood, Tom Bradley Terminal West, Martin Luther King Jr. Transit Center in Compton, and Compton Senior Center, also in Compton. And then we also have Frances Anderton here with us, who will be engaging in a conversation with Michael alongside a lecture. She covers Los Angeles design and architecture in print, radio, podcasts, and public events. She's currently writing a book, Common Ground, Multifamily Housing in Los Angeles, for Angel City Press. She produced and co-hosted the radio series Wasted, Neat Solutions to the Dirty Problem of Waste. It recently aired on KCRW's Greater LA. And for many years, she hosted DNA Design and Architecture radio show, which we all know very well. And before that, Warren Olney's Current Affairs show, Which Way LA, and To the Point, all broadcast on KCRW public radio station. Anderton also programs talks, exhibitions, and events at the Helms Bakery District. She previously curated the exhibition Sink or Swim, Designing for a Sea Change, about resilient architecture, shown at the Annenberg Space for Photography. Honors also include the 2020 Icon Award for the Los Angeles Design Festival. So everybody, please welcome me and joining, and Frances and Michael joining us today. Thank you.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. The program you do at Helms is so wonderful, and I'm so excited to be here today with all the students. And I have to say, to all of you students, how lucky you are to be meeting Michael Anderson. Michael and I only met recently, actually, and it was in the context of this book that he's written. And he allowed me to read his manuscript. I was very intrigued by what he was working on. The book, currently named Urban Magic, Vibrant Black and Brown Communities Are Possible. And the book really gave me, brought me into this world that Stephen just described as esoteric. This world of looking at architecture as an economic generator and understanding the impact that you can make in terms of equity through what you build. And I really felt very strongly on reading Michael's book that he's been working on for several years, based on 3 decades of work in Los Angeles. I really felt that there was so much that he had to say that actually, to be honest, was lacking in architectural education. I myself did go to architecture school, and I looked back on that architecture education and realized that probably in the space of 3 years, we never even talked about the budget of a building. I don't think we were ever given a budget. And Michael takes architecture and says, it is a tool in people's well-being, or it is not, depending on one's circumstances, the political circumstances, the land use, the zoning, and the arithmetic. Michael's brilliant at the arithmetic. He makes my head spin with the numbers as that he pulls together an enormous Rubik's cube of complexity to make his arguments about how to generate more equitable housing in South LA. So anyway, on reading about this and then meeting Michael, I just thought students need to meet him. Students need to open a door into this way of thinking about buildings. It's different from thinking about buildings in form. It's different to thinking about buildings in terms of materials. It's different to thinking about them in terms of theory. All of those ways of thinking about buildings have their place and their importance, absolutely. But what Michael brings to the table is also of great importance. So I'm really pleased to be able to introduce him to you all and talk and have you hear his presentation, and then we'll jump into a Q&A that you guys should all be ready to dive into as well. So Michael, with that, can I throw to you and you take us into your world?
Sure, I will. What a pleasure. Thank you, students, for inviting me to this. Angela, I love the fact that you're sitting on top of Helms Bakery, because I've always looked at how communities have changed over the decades of being in Los Angeles. And I've looked at these things for how can I bring that chemistry into underserved communities. And Wally Marks is a friend of mine, so I love what he's done to the building and the community. He's a really placemaker. So with that, I'll go ahead and, can I share the screen, please?
And Michael, you're ever so slightly going yourself towards the bottom of this. There you go.
Oh yeah.
Sorry. Great, sit up straight.
The chair is going down. Hydraulic.
Joseph, you may need to open up your sharing. I hope he's still with us.
I think Joseph's gone.
Uh-oh. Maybe I don't think I have. Let's see what I can do. No, I got it. I can do it too.
Okay. Oh, cool. Oh, shoot, which screen? I should hope this is the right screen. We may go back and forth, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, cool. So I'll kind of, I decided I would take you sort of the journey of what made me write the book urban magic. And then I'll answer your questions as we go forward. So here we go. So this is sort of some things we're going to go over, but I'll basically tell you why I became an architect. And at first, you already know the projects that I'm currently working on. So thank you for the introduction, Stephen. I don't have to go through this, but it's a blessing to be involved in this and be an associate architect at AECOM. And by the way, this is not the way the buildings look at the plaza. This was a placeholder. We have designed this reinterpretation of mid-century architecture for the plaza buildings. They're very elegant, and as soon as we get permission to show them, I'll be happy to show them to you. And as Stephen said, also, I'm working on Hollywood Park in Inglewood. And Inglewood is, to me, is the success story of what can happen in Black and brown communities with the right leadership and the right momentum of making projects. But what made me want to become an architect was a place that I grew up in the 60s called Laclede Town. If you ever read the book, Defensible Spaces, Security Through Urban Design, is by Oscar Newman. And so while reading this book in SciArc, I'm looking at it and I'm like, oh, there I am with my best friend, Mark Mitchell, walking down Lawton Place. And so not only did I discover it was a great place I lived in, but it was interesting to see this picture. But this was a Black and white community built in the 60s before segregation laws and civil rights. And all the kids came out to be great self-sustaining adults. And it inspired me that instead of renting, it would be great if we could have communities where people own these homes to create a permanent community. I never liked seeing children in poverty. And I always realized the context of the community influences the child's hope and aspirations in life. And I wanted to become an architect. I really wanted to be a developer, but my godfather was an architect, so I decided to try to replicate what he was doing and learn the skills of how to make communities. But these are the three basic things I feel that can always make a community a great place to live. But what always bothers me about a child in poverty is when they lose that hope for what their life will be. And I believe context influences that. This is my godfather, Charles Fleming. He and his partners were the original architects of Martin Luther King Hospital. But living in St. Louis, Charles was a very smart man. He bought a lot of land where they're going to build a new house, new highway. And he built over 100 homes for different clients. And this was his house in 1970. And just watching how he changed communities and things inspired me that maybe I could do this as well. The second person that inspired me, Ray Cappy. I wouldn't be an architect if it wasn't for him. He let me in SciArc. SciArc was cheap. And then also while I was in architecture school, I worked for an urban design collaborative, Archiplan, and Richard Thompson was a principal there. And that's where I started to learn about economic analysis and master planning of communities. And there was a consultant named David Wilcox, who was a famous economist that analyzed economies of when you program communities. And so I started looking at how we could do that and apply that to Black communities in Los Angeles. And I wouldn't be licensed if it wasn't for Norma Scalera. I failed building design 6 times, and then finally I took her class and followed her instructions and finished 3 hours early, so I'm grateful to her. But all throughout my career, I always kept looking at how other cities were changing and how the Black and brown communities were not, especially the Crenshaw community, because Crenshaw was known as the Black business district of Los Angeles. And as an architect, I'd always say to myself, it's not really a business district because it doesn't have office buildings, but it was known as that as it was evolving. So I felt in the 70s, Crenshaw, and a lot of communities, West Hollywood and Santa Monica, all felt the same with average household incomes. But in the 80s, I remember reading an article about how Glendale started building new office buildings by attracting tenants that were leasing space in downtown LA. And it started fueling their redevelopment fund and their agency. And that's when I started looking at how office buildings played a role in bringing salaries into commercial districts and how you could bring them back alive. Early while at Archiplan, I worked on 3rd Street Promenade's preliminary studies. I used to always go on dates and jazz clubs in Westwood. That was the place to hang out in the 80s. And Westwood had a problem with parking. 3rd Street, when it opened, it had 6 parking structures you could easily get to and pretty much put Westwood out of business. It became a major destination, a walkable street. And while doing the planning for 3rd Street, The merchants had the same fears that I hear a lot in community design charrettes about we need cars so that we can get customers and don't close our streets. And in the Crenshaw community, Leimert Park, Degnan Avenue has the same dynamics. Right after 3rd Street opened up and the brothers were driving their lowriders up and down the street, all the merchants said close the street immediately to cars. And since then, it's been a great successful pedestrian-only street. But I just show this as an example of how a city's constantly proactively reinventing its streets, its malls, so that they become destinations for people and places. And my goal was to bring that energy to the Black and brown community. West Hollywood inspired me because before it even became a city, but once it did, I watched how they transformed Santa Monica Boulevard. Sorry, it says Santa Monica, but Santa Monica Boulevard was transformed into this long pedestrian path that's walkable. And I wanted to apply that same process to Crenshaw Boulevard. Santa Monica came up with the concept of transforming the boulevard in 1998. And by 2003, they broke ground on the project and it was completed within 2 years afterwards. And so I thought to myself, how do I bring this to the Crenshaw community? And so in going forward, the first part of my book is about the challenges of change when I decided to stop waiting for the city of Los Angeles to make projects. And let me see if I can put some ideas on paper and lobby for money to make these projects happen. So this is the Leimert Park Crenshaw community. This is Leimert Park Plaza. These are the intersections here of Crenshaw and Martin Luther King Boulevard. This is a Krispy Kreme's that made news headlines when it first opened.
It did?
As economic development. And I was pissed off because right next to it is a Department of Water and Power site. These two properties make up 2 acres of land. And I always thought if this was an office building, Krispy Kreme's would be just a little shop on the first floor. But an office building with, let's say, 300 employees at $50,000 a year, you have a 15 million in salaries up above you. That's economic development. So in the 80s, I wound up working on Leimert Park Village with some facade project, and we were supposed to improve these facades. We wound up putting up these little yellow and blue metal things that was called Community Area Revitalization Effort. And I started getting frustrated that these are just Band-Aid projects done politically, but never transform the community to what it really needs. So I decided I was going to start trying to make my own projects and hopefully get paid while doing it. While lobbying for Leimert Park, the riots happened. And I was lobbying Mayor Bradley to rebuild Leimert Park. And right after the riots, he called me, his deputy mayor, Will Marshall, called me and they said, we have $600,000 for you for Leimert Park. This is me about 40 pounds lighter, sorry. Oops, come on. About 40 pounds lighter, and I was standing in Leimert Park as it was in 1992 with this model. This is when you made models out of, I don't know if you all still make models like this, but you gotta cut a lot of cardboard and stuff. But I had this dream of just taking the park, tearing out the bathroom structure, making this gigantic fountain, and then putting grass steps around it so that people could sit on the grass steps and let it function in its urban environment as a solution, but as a beautiful focal point. Let the water just drown out the car noise. The park actually only cost $450,000, but I wanted an extra 150 grand to put more trees around the other streets so that you could make it totally beautiful. This is the Leimert Park Theater right here, which the city owns. Interesting about Wayne Rakovich, who was the owner of the Wilton Theater one time, to look at how to approach this theater. Because I saw this as a place where Black Hollywood could do its film openings. And it was a way of how do we create momentum of development that starts to change the perception of the community. So it could be the park, do Black film openings and stuff here once in a while and make it into a great place.
Michael, can I just ask you about Wayne Rakovich? Did you say that Wayne Rakovich, who is to the students who may not have heard that name, he's a well respected developer, property owner in Los Angeles who's adaptively reused a lot of historic buildings. Did you yourself meet with him, or did he own the theater at that time? What was the
No, so Wayne owned the Wiltern, and what I did was I went to talk to him about Marla Gibbs owned this theater. Marla Gibbs was a lady that played in Did she play in the Jeffersons or Room 222, a black comedy show in the 70s? You all may not remember this.
I
But-
remember the name, but not
But
yet.
anyhow, she owned the theater, but I brought her there. I brought Wayne there to get ideas. When Wayne first opened the Wiltern, his first entertainer there was Alvin Ailey's dance studio, right?
Hmm.
So I wanted to get his knowledge of how to approach this as a project. And Wayne basically renovated the Wiltern Theater, but he brought a theater operator in to do the marketing and things. And so I brought him to the theater, and people were offended. Why'd you bring this white man into my theater? So I was like, okay, but that, that happens, right? So, but anyway, I'm not going to digress on that too much, but it was an opportunity. The city of Los Angeles owns it now. I pray to God that they get it to where it's successful. This is Leimert Park today. So the sad ending about it was I got the 600,000. I did design and construction documents, and then somebody felt the South Central Los Angeles Task Force should wait and come up with their own plan. Now, I had gotten the money, and I spent my money to help them get the money. And the purpose was to do a project that could be replicated in other communities, because I really wanted kids to work on this project, even if it's just planting flowers. I wanted kids to take some ownership. But in 2000, the park was renovated. Today, it's got a fence around it. And to me, it just demonstrated how poor urban design does not solve urban problems. And somebody put up this beautiful fence, which really didn't solve the problem. So I got mad when I lost this project, but this was still around the riots. And I decided people are talking about jobs, but nobody's talking about office buildings. At that time, a lot of government buildings were 50 plus years old. You were hearing complaints about asbestos. And I said, I want to start lobbying government officials to be anchor tenants in new office buildings for Crenshaw. So the upper left image was what I dreamed of Crenshaw being, looked to be, excuse me. And then this LA Business Journal did an article on the project. And my goal was, and I'm just marketing, right? So if we could get 6,000 workers in Crenshaw making 50 grand a year, we would have 300 million in salaries in Crenshaw. And then you could start seeing more capital coming into the community. So the focus was the Leimert Park Village, but then also put funding into these nodes over here for the purpose of the private sector to fill the gaps in between. And I thought it would bring back Black and brown people that lived in the community before. Actually, not even just Black and brown people, but the Japanese Americans that grew up in here. This is the community that during World War II went to the concentration camps. And I really just wanted to have it grow back to what it could be. So I started marketing and lobbying these plans. There were alley beautification projects to be included with it. And so while lobbying to do the office building, one military building that was damaged during the riots was over at La Brea and Rodeo. And I wound up competing with GSA for the lease for that tenant. It was a medical processing building. And so this plan in front of you shows the dream for Crenshaw at that time as the major projects. It's 9 projects. But this represented an office complex over here that was built in the 50s. Next to it, I wanted to build this office building designed by Rick Keating. Rick Keating was an architect at SOM. He designed the gas tower in downtown Los Angeles. So while I was lobbying to get leases, I did not have any office building experience. So part of the lease requirement is you had to build an office building before, design it before, and you had to get the funding. I had none of those things. I just had a dream. But Linda Griego, who was the head of Rebuild LA, introduced me to Rick Keating. He designed the building. And then Nelson Rising, who was a principal at Thomas McGuire, he introduced me to Niall Leslie, who was a developer of California Plaza. He teamed up with me. And then all of a sudden I got $5.5 million letter of commitment from the Community Development Department. And then I went to Bank of America, and ironically, Robert Yamaguchi grew up in Crenshaw. He was a senior vice president, went to Dorsey High School. And he said, if I got the lease, they would put in $6.5 million. So I was up to $14 million, I think, or $12 million, I can't do my math, on a $14 million building. Fast forward, politics interfere. And how can I say this polite? I got beat by 17 cents on a lease. The existing landlord beat my price of $26 a month, a year, came in at $1.99. And to me, I was a little frustrated because I wanted the redevelopment agency to step up and start making new buildings and office buildings in Crenshaw. Crenshaw hasn't had a new office building since 1954. So by then, this was my second wound. And another part of the Crenshaw project was called 100 Palm Trees for Crenshaw Boulevard. It was inspired by Santa Monica Boulevard. And it was a dream of doing something like this with palm trees, with lights up and down the street. But I really just wanted to unify the sidewalk all the way down on both sides, put in some shading trees, because I felt if we did a mile stretch of Crenshaw where it was beautiful, a lot of businesses would just come because the street has totally transformed in its physical appearance. So interesting, I was asked, how do we get funding for this? I helped people out in terms of talking to the city. I wanted this to be one of my other projects. I wound up helping the secure the $1.5 million, but a nonprofit corporation beat me out for the funding. So that was like my third knockdown. And as far as I was concerned, I was really losing a lot of inspiration to continue trying these projects in the community.
Michael, can I interject very, very quickly? I'm so sorry. Hearing you tell this story, I'm thinking that at this point, you're age 34. It said so in the article that was printed about you. You're young, and yet you've got these mega visions for the neighborhood. How are you even get a hearing? And whose door are you knocking on when you do this? You said you brought in Wayne Ratkovich, you went to see Rick, you got this, this big letter of what's the word that you used? You got some sort of prior approval for this plan. I mean, you're really ambitious here, and you're thinking way beyond the box of being an architect. You're thinking like a developer. So again, whose doors are you knocking on, and how do you even start to think like this?
It was kind of crazy. But what it came from was that after the riots, they had all these meetings about corporations were interested in helping the community develop itself or transform or rebuild. So the energy in all those meetings were, we want to help rebuild. And I noticed it was real estate companies. I noticed there was a lot around leasing and things of that nature. So that's how I started focusing on office buildings. But politically, what I did is, a friend of mine knew Ted Kennedy. So I went to Senator Ted Kennedy's office to start lobbying. Got letters of support from him. And then once I went to Ted Kennedy's office, and then somebody told me to go to Dianne Feinstein. And so I started going to the official's office lobbying for the lease and things. The challenge tended to come down to the community's fear of change. And then there was also other competing interests for them to get recognized on their project. So in many ways, I lost out to the community's fear of change, but also people wanting what they thought was their projects to go forward. And really, these projects that I was creating, I was trying to communicate are their projects. They weren't mine. It seemed to be a perception that I was this guy coming into the community like an outside developer trying to make the change. And I'm like, I'm Black, y'all Black. But the thing was, I think there's just a lot of fear of change. And that hesitancy happens a lot. And I think that's what really prevents economic development in most of our communities.
But also, you were an architect. You were coming in as an architect, going into this realm of development. And I would imagine, did that also raise some eyebrows? It's like, and who are you? It
did. It raised some good and some bad. It was interesting. Most of the support was outside the community. Inside the community, there were what I call very loud vocal voices, but the majority of people really wanted these things to go forward. So that's part of the reason why I wrote the book. Was actually a friend of mine that worked at Metro inspired me to write the book, because she said nobody's experienced the different facets as I had. And she said I should put that down on paper.
And the book's really, really interesting. You both walking you through all the kind of financial calculations that you're doing, but also the politics and these efforts that you make continually to try and to knock on doors and get people to get interested in these ideas that you have, and the politics therein, and there's some level of competitiveness, and there's political rivalries, and you explore that in the book. But again, I'm just amazed that you you just thought in this way because it's not something that's one is trained to. You're not trained to think like this at architecture school. You're trained to expect that there will be somebody else who's thinking like this, and you come in and draw up the plans for, you know, put flesh on the bones for them. In your case, you take it upon yourself to be that generator of the ideas, and that's something that I think is so fascinating about you, and I admire your just courage that you had to just think you could do it.
Well, how can I say this? I don't feel full doing buildings that don't improve people's lives. I like doing architecture. I like working on the Clippers project, but for some reason, all my life, all I've ever wanted was communities to be like modern LaCree towns, where there were people of different cultures living together, where kids grew up having fun. That's why I became an architect. And my purpose was to figure out how to make successful development, which comes down to a business chemistry that kind of feeds investments to go into areas. Also, we won't have architectural projects if we don't have clients wanting to build these buildings. So the other purpose was, how do I make that chemistry take place that makes people want to come in Black and brown communities and build these things and inspire young children to be in these professions of making communities, right? Because we're going to have another generation behind people such as yourself. The students in this lecture right now are our future creators. We're going to rely on them to make our lives better when we get older and aren't in this game anymore. And so the other part is for them to understand all the dynamics so that they can be better. At the same time, our industry's changed so much that architects have to be in a position to where they are influencing the money, because you're kind of vulnerable if you're waiting for the client to say, hey, you know, Alyssa, I like you. I want you to design my building. Maybe, but if she comes up with a financial solution and a great concept that's feasible and brings it forward, she may be more attractive to a developer to have that project built. But her outcome may be, I want it to be more beneficial to the community, not just a math problem, but a math problem that's mutually beneficial to everyone. So
great. So here we are at one of your projects that does become flesh.
So this was the only one that I built out of the whole Crenshaw proposal, was the Leimert Park home. And the beautiful thing about this was it was a constraint, first-time family buyer. You had to make $36,000 a year and have 2 kids, which the math was crazy. Didn't work out. It was a federally funded program. But what I did was I just kept lobbying for money to support as what I call silent equity. CRA gave me some money. I contacted Andrew Cuomo. Was it Andrew Cuomo? Mario Cuomo was Secretary of HUD, I think, at the time. I called their office directly and told them we need to get more money for LA's housing program. They increased the silent second on their end. And then I got the families about $54,000 in silent money, meaning they don't have to finance it. And since CRA went away, I think their $54,000 debt went away. So that worked out well for them. But basically they paid $800 a month, and now these houses are worth $700,000. So when I was at an event with Professor Green at USC, I learned about, instead of focusing on single families, focus on first-time buyers to get triplex. But before I go down there, I'll tell you the last project I got funding for was Century Boulevard. I secured about $8 million in funding for that. But this was before Mayor Butts became the mayor. The city couldn't file the federal authorization. I filed that. And then the previous mayor allowed Public Works to give the contract to AECOM. So I was like, you know, they didn't really need to work. But that was my experience where I realized all this stuff didn't work. Okay, so the only thing I take a joy in is that the families, I went to go see them recently, they are so happy with their homes. And so they're happy. I think the kids living in a house their mother owns, that created security where the kids may replicate that themselves.
Just to clarify about the houses, you bought the land, you developed the land, and
yes.
Correct. And then you sold the houses.
Yes, so the money was provided by LA Housing Department on what's called the first time buyer program. Initially, they gave me something like $109,000 per unit, so I had to build 6 to kind of make it work out. I purchased a lot for around 180 grand. That included architectural permit fees and all this other stuff you can read about in the book. I thought I was gonna make like 70 grand. In the end, I spent 80 grand. So, but the only beautiful thing about it was I didn't have to pay any of the debt service until the houses were sold. So I wound up moving in one of the houses for 2.5 years because I said, well, fine, shit, I'm sorry. I might as well just stay here and get some return on investment. Also, it took the city of Los Angeles so long to file the paperwork that typically the buyer's loans would fall out because the city hadn't finished their paperwork on their side. It was a nightmare, but you know, that was a way of learning what the difficulties are. But now I'm going to talk about another level of experience. So in Compton, I was hired to redo the transit center. The transit center in Compton, they wanted us to add a bus fueling and washing station to this facility. And I found myself renegotiating because next to it, you can see in this picture, was new townhome. Now I was like, how did you want to have buses getting washed next to this townhouse development? So I wound up renegotiating their deal with Metro by showing they had sat on the money for 7 years. So I said, if you build everything you're supposed to build, it's going to cost you $36 million. And so they were not going to get any money. So I said, but there's an alternative. We can tear this thing down and just build this little transit station. And I had a hidden agenda behind it, but it was an agenda that's benefit the city. Was this is the transit station, and then we had a contract to do a senior center. I said I would put that on the back side. And I was trying to get Compton to do a TOD development. And this is before the new mayor, Asia Brown, became in office. So all this happened prior to her administration, which I wish it did happen. But anyway, I was kind of inspired by Robin Perkins' LAX signs. And I said, well, let's do something where you go by, you know it's Compton. We had these planter boxes in the back that were supposed to have 25-foot tall bamboo plants. But for some reason, the city took them out. You know, I had seen the movie Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I saw the lady swinging through the bamboo, and I was like, that would be cool in Compton to tell the brothers, look, you can do that too. But in reality, I just was trying to sell it to the city as a landscape effect, to give them something beautiful that when the train goes by, the bamboo would sway in the wind. But, you know, it didn't work. So, but I did design the community center. I put it on the back side of this project. But one of the things I want to show you, the community center was supposed to go over here where this building in the red is. But what I did was I entitled this site to build the senior housing to complement it. So that way I would make a transit district in the community. So this was housing, the community center, plus the transit station. So to give you a little bit more context, as I was going forward, I was still working in Leimert Park. CRA had me do a master plan of Degnan and Crenshaw. This is what we came up with, a study, but no building ever took place. Because to this day, this project still looks the same. But while doing the project, I did the Crenshaw TOD. I was the author of the Crenshaw LAX Transit Corridor, the joint development study for Metro. But the thing that frustrated me is I do these studies and they just become a notebook that goes on the shelf. They never transfer into a real project. So I started looking at like, how can I change things? And it comes down to leadership. Inglewood is a powerful example of what happens when leadership starts to fuel a project. When the redevelopment agency got abolished, Inglewood had about 49 million in housing funds that didn't stand. They had 18 million in some other development funds. And Mayor Butts gave those funds to Madison Square Garden to do the Forum. Once the Forum started having concerts and getting renovated, Hollywood Park started to go forward. During negotiations on Hollywood Park, the NFL stadium got added to the equation. And Inglewood has in 9 years received $9 billion of private investment in this small town to make this new Universal Studios in Inglewood that is going to make Inglewood basically a cash cow. But the final thing that I want to go into, what Urban Magic is really about, is I've always looked at, since I built my houses, how to use federal government as equity to seed self-sustaining growth. And this is where we're going to get into the housing and transit benefits. I learned this from Leimert Park Homes that I showed you. And now what we're looking at is providing capital as equity to enable home ownership on a large scale. And this is the perfect time for a new presidential administration to do this. But basically, we're funding home equity to enable home ownership for a large number of families in Los Angeles' Black and brown communities, but doing it in a way that in the end, it generates $1.5 billion in new county property taxes. And so this is what we're acting on. This is our window of opportunity. On Inauguration Day, President Biden ordered advancing solutions for underserved communities, Black and brown. Because of Prop 209 in California, no government agency can fund a program based on race. But the underserved communities that are Black and brown, I'm trying to figure out a solution for, and that is to use federal funds in a public-private partnership to acquire land, entitle it, and build TLC communities along the West Santa Ana Branch Corridor and the blue line of the Metro. And this is the schedule to your right. President Biden wants Office of Management Budget to have pilot programs by June 20th and August 8th to have identified those opportunities. Right now, I've already presented this concept to the San Francisco Federal Reserve Board. They like the concept of giving equity to first-time buyers. And the reason I went to the the San Francisco Federal Reserve Board is because that's where our Treasury Secretary came from. And I want her staff to help figure this out. So this is the program, Equity Buyers for Equity Home Ownership for First-Time Buyers. It targets 3 different family groups along the West Santa Ana Branch Corridor, which is primarily a working class, low income community, and communities of Compton, Watson, Willowbrook. And it's to give single family homes in the form of a triplex with 2 income properties so that you have a house plus 2 income properties along a new transit corridor that gets equity so that they have a low down payment when they're buying a house. So the banks like this program. The other component of that is to build 4plexes on a lot where 2 families can buy a property. And the purpose is to make families start to live in proximity to each other and start to create a method of successions of wealth through home ownership. At the same time, to provide families with accessory dwelling units, which we finally picked up and caught on to. And I'll show you how these things layer to add up in terms of improving quality of life. Basically, an ADU is a home in mom's backyard. But why not remodel mom's house at the same time, give her some silent equity, and we're targeting 50,000 homes along this West Santa Ana Branch Transit Corridor. So this is how we create added value in the community, just to give an example. These are accessory dwelling units and triplexes in this community. This is the metro station that's to be built at Slauson and Long Beach Avenue. The Blue Line station is already there, but this is where the West Santa Ana branch comes up and connects to it. These are parcels identified through the transit studies as land to be developed. But if we start putting triplexes and 4plexes in these communities, in this half-mile radius, we've only created $30 million in value by building accessory dwelling units, triplexes in these communities. What the purpose is, we're bringing the kids home by giving them triplexes and 4plexes and accessory dwelling units. What that does is that increases the average household income of safety. So I'm doing what gentrification fears do. In this case, what we're doing is we're giving increase in household income by bringing the younger generation and professional college graduates to come home and live in the houses of the communities they grew up in. So this is the Azalea Shopping Center. This is Southgate, but this is sort of how we're targeting 100,000 families. The purpose is to reduce successions of poverty and start building family wealth. A friend of mine said, this is recreation. And I said, yes, it is. But the key thing about it is the banks like it. The banks like it because the debt ratio is 65% loan and 35% equity in the housing model. So we're replenishing the community from within, thus bringing the younger generation of working people to the communities they came from. Right now, it's a dream, but I'm doing this along the West Santa Ana Branch Corridor because we have 9 stations outside downtown that are in low-income Black and brown communities. This is based on Metro's West Santa Ana Branch Strategic Implementation Plan. And what happened when this plan was created, the cities were asking Metro, how do we go to the next step? And Metro said, it's up to you to figure out how to do that. Not rudely, but just because Metro doesn't develop. So what I'm trying to form is a public-private partnership to use private capital to master plan property and to entitle it and sell to developers so that we can build houses. So right now we're looking at a pilot project. I just met with Supervisor Mitchell's office today. Supervisor Solis's office has been helping me for the last 2 or 3 months and listening to this and seeing how to do this. So right now where I am is lobbying this component of the program for land acquisition using private capital, entitle it, sell it to developers to build affordable housing combined with for sale housing and commercial development. Metro has land around each of these stations, but instead of doing things in a half mile, we can do these things in a mile radius and connect them with first and last mile projects that are like streetscapes, bike paths, and things of that nature. All this purpose is to combine and make, when we do these studies, called how do you make a healthy community? In my perspective, this is how we make a healthy community. So let's set a goal. Let's see if we want to do this before the Olympics so that the people in this community can have a transit corridor. But this is called the LA County COVID Economic Recovery through Home Ownership. That's the title I've given it for right now. I hope it works, but that's where we are right now. But this is the program. These are the community benefits, is that a program this large, we're able to help small business team up with large corporations where we filter money down to the grassroots of the community and help young children to learn about economic development. But also this plan is to bring money in the community at a large scale. We're basically asking the federal government to provide $30 billion over 6-7 years. And I'll show you how the return on investments come back. So right now we have the window of opportunity. The Biden administration is looking for funding. And so basically, if we gave the average family $500,000 in equity, it adds up to $30 billion in silent equity. But what it does is it brings banks in $90 billion in loans, so the banks make money from participating in this transaction. The reason I'm taking this approach is if banks are interested in doing it, then they're going to lobby for the silent soft second equity because the banks are making money. It's not a debt, but I'm trying to make money go into economic chemistry versus going into rental housing like HUD just to pay debt and temporary shelter. By building triplexes and fourplexes, we bring 200,000 new homes into LA's market. We need 600,000 units. So the purpose is the whole team to be transparent so we can figure it out. But I've calculated out of the 420 billion we cause over this 7-year period, we'll generate 756,000 jobs. Thus, the federal government to get back some of its equity through withholding and Social Security tax. And so my question to Cal Poly is, do you all have an economics department that could run an analysis on this for me, just so I can add this to my argument? So I just presented this to another county supervisor today, and they're talking about next steps. But I am building up team members to make this happen. And the way that it's mutually beneficial is, if the county, I'm saying, you build these houses, you've created yourself new property tax revenue of $1.5 billion a year. That funds the county needs to rebuild our infrastructure. Most of these cities I do work in, the water, sewer, storm drain lines are 90, 70 years old. Compton had wood sewer lines in it. So the challenge that developers will have is the cities say, you have to pay fees to upgrade our infrastructure. My approach is, how do we make it where the county's generating revenues and the cities are generating revenues through development that they can then bond that to buy modern infrastructure, not repair it, but new infrastructure based on fourth world country technologies. And the reason I say that is they have to be extremely efficient. But we start to have solutions for repairing damaged communities to function in the 21st century at a reduced gas house emissions and things. So that's the larger purpose of this program. The land that's bought is to relocate businesses that don't work, put those businesses in better facilities that meet our functional needs for the 21st century. So this is where we are. I have the Office of Controller of Currency on board. I have the Federal Reserve Board on board in San Francisco. In other words, they like it. I have to do the work on the next step. But the purpose of the Office of Controller of Currency is that Senator Warren tried to pass a Senate bill to fund Black and brown communities because from 1930 all the way up to the 70s, banks and the federal government participated in keeping Black and brown families from owning a home. And that is what's created this wealth gap. This approach that I'm presenting is to address that. And that's why this is a pilot project. I tell my teaming partners, this has to be 100% transparent because we want to figure out how to do it right so that we can do it again and it makes it a successful business transaction. Because that's how banks are going to look at it. The Office of Controller, Beth Castro, she was like, we need to have a bank form. And then the Federal Reserve Board said, no, we don't need to have a bank form right now because they like it. But what I'm trying to do is make it possible where the government says to the banks, we're doing this. Now you have to do this. And if I could figure out how to make the banks $1.5 billion a year on a pilot project, actually I'll make more than that, but there's other things to it. Then they will like say, let's do this again. So that's where we are. This is the rest of the team. The purpose is to get the letter to Treasury Secretary Yellen, Marcia Fudge, and Cecilia Rouse. And then these are local political people. I'm already doing the team building, so this is where we are. And oh, what's the next step? Can Cal Poly conduct, who put that there? An economic analysis.
It would be a great exercise for the students. Michael, thank you. It's really great and really really interesting and makes one's head spin with all the numbers. A question, just so that I fully if I speak for everybody, fully understand the housing equity plan. So what is currently slated for those sites?
So the sites that I'm targeting initially are sites that have been identified in the community vision studies done when Metro was doing its TLC plan. Because those are sites the communities have identified they would like to make changes to. So like in South Bay, for example, where you saw the shopping center with the brother on the bike, right across the street is a truck logistics company on 38 acres, right? So under this approach, we would acquire the land in a public-private partnership to transform to the housing, but relocate the trucking facility in a modern facility. So in other words, you're not just buying the land and telling somebody to go away. You find a site for the trucking facility to go to, you build them a modern facility for electric trucks and has chargers, starts to be oriented more towards lower greenhouse gas emissions facility. But that becomes the chemistry of repairing and relocating businesses and modernizing our entire environment. I don't know if I answered your question, man.
Yeah, I think you did. And would that involve some kind of eminent domain? I mean, it sounds...
I don't know. For me, it may be necessary, but the way that I look at it is go into the community and ask the community what they would like to do and try to create a mutual agreement where an owner says, okay, I will sell if you help me find a new piece of property here. But where lands are open, where buildings have been torn down, those are ripe where you could just go right in and put in infill housing, right? So a lot of these communities are 70, 80 years old. So there's still parcels that are underdeveloped, commercial buildings that may be dead that could be transformed either into multifamily housing, a new office building. So those you don't have to do eminent domain. You can go in and just make a deal with the landowner or somebody if they want to sell. You could probably find enough owners willing to sell property that want to sell property that you could start your pilot project because you need 6,000 acres to accomplish this whole program.
That's what I was going to ask next, is what scale does it have to be to work?
6,000 acres around 12 transit stations. So you could actually go up to 2 miles beyond the transit station. So you could do a lot of infill development. And I'm sure it's a lot of single family homes that would like accessory dwelling units, which would be a great absorption rate there.
And would the alternative housing solution there be a bigger mixed use? Sorry, would we otherwise be seeing mixed use blocks going up of rental apartments? Is that what we would typically be seeing?
So the purpose is to combine rental and ownership, but to shift more towards ownership, but also make an abundance of land for nonprofit corporations they wouldn't have to buy land. Actually, if we have a public-private entity in terms of acquiring land, if it's involved with the government, then the government could actually ground lease that land for affordable housing, thus lowering the cost of developing affordable housing for seniors and for homeless shelters and things of that nature, transitional housing. But I haven't thought that all through. I'm just trying to create a multiple solution.
Right. I mean, I'm going to jump to one of the questions actually from Angela Anthony with Helms, because it really ties into what you were just saying about going in there and seeing if you can, pitch this idea to people who will then be keen on perhaps, selling their business or having it moved to work with your project. So anyway, Angela says, such an interesting presentation, Michael. Again, you're a trained architect, you're interested in development, but really you will be building or developing based on advocacy first. One is advocacy a really big piece of this? And when did you, I guess, decide that this was the path that you wanted to go on?
So it basically came out of, it takes too long for Black and brown communities to make the changes that I saw taking places in other communities. And it comes down to terms of most Black and brown communities or cities don't have the financial resources or the people to graduate beyond their current operating circumstances. Inglewood is a rare success story in the sense, one, they had a great mayor that decided he was not going to drag anything out. They had a $2 billion project on hold for like 6 or 7 years. And it's right down the street from the airport. So what made me decide on it is that I thought, just like I did Leimert Park, if we could get beyond the studies and start going after the money necessary just to do the first steps. And you can't just focus on doing that one project you've identified. You got to focus on doing multiple projects, because the Black and brown communities need tens of thousands of projects to make themselves a modern place for a child to grow up and become a self-sustaining adult, and to create the tax base to afford decent education and public services. So when you look at public services, communities with higher tax base, they get all the public services. So my purpose was, how do I raise the tax base? And how do I do it where it creates jobs locally? So did I answer the question? That's what drives it.
I think so. It was Angela's question. I'm sure she'll indicate if you didn't. But you certainly raised a very, very interesting point, which is this issue of leadership. You just mentioned the mayor of Inglewood, and you're referring to Mayor Butts, I think, and you talk about Mayor Butts in your book. And Mayor Butts, interestingly, was previously, he was police chief in City of Santa Monica, and you often hold up Santa Monica as a kind of example of economic development that's to be emulated.
Right.
Tell us about Mayor Butts. I think you've worked with him directly, you know him, you admire him. What do you think he kind of brought to the table in Inglewood that has been such a game changer that wasn't happening in other Black and brown communities, at least as you lay it out in your book?
Well, he didn't waste time. I've seen a lot of communities leave money on the table. Just like when we came to Compton, the money had been on the table for 7 years for the transit center. Thank God it had, because they would have built a fuel station, which wouldn't have served it. But when he came to Inglewood, there was a $2 billion project on hold. And
the football stadium. The football stadium.
But it wasn't a football stadium.
Oh.
It was Hollywood Park. The football.
Hollywood Park, of course.
The football got added to it. But that's where I talk about where when Stan Kroenke's interest came into Hollywood Park, and it's funny, I'm from St. Louis, so I know why the Rams wanted to move out of St. Louis. So that he decided to find a place to relocate the team. And Inglewood happened to be a great place because you had Hollywood Park, you had the land next to it, and the space between the farm. I don't know why those decisions were made, but the fact that he acted quickly, and then instead of giving the state of California $18 million in redevelopment fund, he put it into the farm. He had to deal with the same thing that the community said, why are you giving Madison Square Garden $18 million? Well, when Madison Square Garden renovated the farm and it became the concert venue it did, that fear of change in that community turned into, I'm proud to live in Inglewood. When Hollywood Park started kicking off and you got an NFL stadium coming in there and the city's going to earn sales taxes off those receipts, that changed everybody's position from fear of change, and the real estate prices of the homes went up, but Black and brown families weren't moving out, right? Some families were benefiting from their value going up, protected by Prop 13 because they're not getting taxed for that. So now you start to get the household average incomes increasing. New developers transform Daniel Freeman Hospital into a housing development. So now you're going to get that rise in income where Black and brown communities always say, we want a Trader Joe's, we want a Nordstrom's Rack. Well, Trader Joe's is going to come to Inglewood because the household incomes are going up. And yes, you're going to have all this dynamics of affecting existing businesses and things, but now the existing businesses can make loans because there are more customers than they had before in this growth. So that's the thing that I admired about it. And I looked at Santa Monica because Santa Monica became a partnership of, I forgot the architect's name. It was an architect, a city council person, a couple of private sector people got together and formed a public-private partnership to redevelop 3rd Street Promenade as a project. And that accelerated all the other development around it. So that's why I look at it in terms of what started the first level of success, and then what chemistry did it cause to create successions of investment. And that's what I want to happen in our community.
So Robert Ladd has posed a couple of questions. Robert, if it's okay with you, I'm going to go to your second question first. He says, you seem to have an argument to promote density and to counteract the gentrification argument. Can you explain that?
So really, well, I answer the part about gentrification first, and then you have to remind me about the first part. Gentrification in our communities is typically people from not of Black and brown cultures moving in and then creating that chemistry that makes people that are renting move out. My perspective is there's a lot of Black and brown people making upper incomes that came from these communities that would be attracted to come back into the communities if they saw the growth happening in a positive way. At the same time, their coming back into the community is going to bring their lifestyles to the commercial streets. And commercial streets create a vibe that younger generations like to be a part of. Melrose Avenue did this. Santa Monica Boulevard has it in a way because we developed some houses right behind Santa Monica Boulevard. And that vibe is what makes it become hip. So I'm using the culture that exists by bringing the kids home who've gone away to college to come back and start bringing new life. And that's what's going to happen in Inglewood as well. A lot of young Black and brown people are moving into Inglewood, but also young white folks in other cultures are moving into Inglewood and even opening businesses. And that's beautiful because you're diversifying a community, both in income and culture. And even that's beneficial to the kids because now they're exposed to other cultures that are in the same proximity to them that they don't normally engage with. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of LA, of how we can solve this, utilize our diversity to make greater quality of life. The question of density is that if you look at how, it's funny, I go hiking in Runyon Canyon. If you're at the top of Runyon Canyon, you see West Hollywood, Hollywood, and Sunset, you see all 4 or 5-story buildings. And then you start seeing single family homes. When you go to places like Compton and some places, their commercial corridors and the residences behind it don't reflect that density. And often it looks like it could absorb that density. Every city, based on your general plan, is supposed to have a plan to absorb housing. And I think we have to come up with a solution for low-income areas to figure out how to absorb housing so that they can raise the average household income, thus raising the quality of life. Does that answer the question?
But without causing people to lose their apartments if they happen to be renting.
Correct.
And the diversity argument's an interesting one because you're definitely a fan of diversity and of people coming in from bringing different cultures into Inglewood, say, or South LA, but not everybody is. You know, that's actually become kind of a real point of friction right now. And there are some activists within the communities that right now are more, one might say, very fearful of gentrification and perhaps a little bit more sort of protectionist, and that's probably the wrong word to use, but they're fearful of gentrification and hence very nervous of people coming in from outside the community, thinking that will bring gentrification in a negative, in a way that impacts many people negatively. So how do you find yourself in conversations about that, where you're on a different side of the gentrification argument?
When we did the Leimert Park feasibility study in 2008, it was put on hold. The solution was put on hold because there was such a loud voice of not wanting to redevelop those parking lots that in Leimert Park Village. The thing that was disappointing was it was about 25 people who were very loud. At the presentations, often residents would come up and say, we really like the idea, we want you to stick to it, right? But what happened is, as a result, Leimert Park missed that window of opportunity to develop back in 2008 and 2010. 2008 was a bad year, but at the same time, that window of opportunity was missed. So those parking lots are still parking lots, right? So Crenshaw's community didn't grow. So there's a strong fear of change, but there's also a fear of not knowing what to do. And so it's interesting, the studies we did in 2010 of what the community wanted, they were showing me the identical type development I see in West Hollywood. Now they were comfortable with 4-story buildings. Now they were comfortable with streetscapes and things that reflect a modern quality of life. So I think it has more to do with fear of change and not knowing what the end product is. And those people, not those people, but when the community is very scared, politicians tend to give in and listen to that. Now, the other side of the coin, that's just like, suppose Mayor Butts didn't give the $18 million to the farm, right? It would have still been owned by the church, may not have been generating revenue, but that chemistry made that change where people that were pushing back, I think, are very comfortable with the fact that that investment was made. So you have to work through it. And it's funny, I call it like, I remodeled my house when my mother's house when my grandmother was living. She hated me for the whole year while remodeling that house. When that house was done, all her girlfriends, she would bring over all the time. But it's just her, she didn't know the process. And even though I was an architect, I mean, it was crazy. She had church members calling me and stuff. But once we remodeled the house, she was bragging, bringing people over. And I think that's an example of the community's fear of change, that we have to push through. Politicians have to push through and get those projects going the first year in office. Because then by the third year in office, people are comfortable with the changes you're making, that you can go on. And Ingle was an example of that, because that's why Butts has been successful. And people didn't want him to be mayor first in politics. The political groups were like, no, you're not a politician. But that's changed now because he has a cash cow. So.
Right, and you said actually in reference to Mayor Butts, you said that one of the things that he didn't do, which others have done, is you use the phrase left money on the table. Can you just explain that? So
I've had some clients, I was doing a sound insulation project with Inglewood School District. There was a settlement and the airport had something like $118 million in the settlement. And so we were working on the project and I was trying to get the school district to spend the money, you have a settlement. Settlement means they're going to give you the money. But politics in the school board at that time interfered, and I don't think they got the money because they never finished the drawing. So I think they got like $10 million or maybe $15 million out of the settlement. So what I mean by that is you still have schools that have a poor sound insulation with jets flying. Jets are getting quieter, it's getting better, but that money could have been used to leverage to match state funds to truly modernize the school, right? So that's where I've experienced leaving money on the table before. In Compton with the transit station, that money was almost left on the table. Fortunately, at that time, Councilman Isidore Hall stepped up. He saw the money, he put out RFPs. We got 3 of the projects, and that's how they got a new transit center. That's why they got the new community center, and we renovated Raymond Park. But that happens a lot in cities that do not have the knowledgeable staff to move that forward. And that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of proactive, is because if cities have more revenue, you can hire better skilled people to help serve and improve the city.
Got it. Robert Ladd has another question for you. Says, have you entertained alternatives to the department store Anchor should it go out of business? He suggests, what about a bazaar like in Chinatown? Are you rethinking the anchor tenant in some of these concepts you have?
So there's a challenge with, there's a prejudice and a bias sometimes with bringing large anchor tenants into these communities, Black and brown communities. So that's why is the Crenshaw Economic Development Proposal, but even now the opportunity exists where developers could build office buildings, because the county right now is reassessing 52 million square feet of facilities. They're in strategic planning. Those employees could serve as anchor tenants in new office buildings. I look for that because the county can sign long-term leases. I'm not saying occupy the whole building, but occupy enough of the building to make the deal safe where businesses that are already in the community can move in a beautiful building. When I had my office in Lamar Park, I moved because the area was too hard in contact over here near LAX. But I am thinking of, you always need anchor tenants sometimes to see things, but you want to make sure that anchor tenant works in terms of the environment you're trying to create. So.
Oh, hang on. Sorry. Thank you, Michael. I just got a message about a question. I think, Stephen, can you hear me? Can you say something?
Yeah, Jose has a question.
Yeah,
His
yeah.
hand is raised right there.
Yeah, how do I see the raised hand? Hang on.
It's just on the screen with everybody.
Oh.
It's just in the far left corner.
Oh,
and
hang on.
And
I must be in the wrong thing.
I am so sorry. I was on the wrong screen.
I'm in the wrong. So, can Jose, can Jose speak the question?
Yes, he can.
Yes, Jose, welcome. Welcome. Let's hear your question.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. So Michael, yeah, I noticed that in a lot of the examples you were giving, it was oftentimes you were initiating a lot of these efforts, and sometimes you would refer to Inglewood as an example of an organized effort. And I'm curious if you've noticed any like organizing around the efforts that you're describing you've been involved in, because I guess one thought that keeps occurring to me when I listen to your efforts is how sustainable is it, for example, for the energy of your team, for example, given that you're there's a lot of setbacks that you've shared with us. And I mean, you mentioned these neighborhoods in LA, and I'm familiar with some of the ones that I grew up here in LA as well. And I'm just kind of unsure about how we get a more collective, I suppose, like redistributed effort going. And I'm curious if you've noticed or are aware of organized efforts of that sort.
No, I don't. I mean, I try to take advantage. Most communities already have some momentum of something going. Metro's got transit improvements. Some communities are doing first and last mile projects. No, I just looking at, and I try to look at future trends. Like, for example, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to have Uber Lyft vehicles starting in Los Angeles in 2023. Do you know what the Uber Lyft vehicles are? They're basically vertical crafts, like, they fly from Westlake, you fly to the roof of something at Union Station. So the pilots of the Uber Airs are supposed to start in 2023. So if you start thinking of your community of how you can incorporate a future parking structure for autonomous vehicles to be stored and Uber Air to lift to land at that becomes an element that can make a community very attractive for additional investment. So Jose, the things that I try to look for is how do we bring a futuristic element into our underserved communities in a way that it becomes the new economic engine in the community that we didn't expect. So yeah, that's the things that I kind of look for to try to get started, because we have to do things different in Black and brown communities, and that's okay, but political leadership needs to drive it even further. I mean, we need success in all areas of quality of life, period, because otherwise our kids will do without something. And my energy and my focus is just to try to keep going. It is painful when you get major setbacks. I got to tell you, the projects in Crenshaw, those were financially painful, but it was also painful that the small voices, the loud voices that were small in numbers, kept winning the argument. And I really believe all of us takes a team to do this. So we need to work together and get it done. So, but you get egos in politics, you know that. So anyway.
Michael, do you think that architecture education should fold more of this type of thinking into the curriculum?
I do.
Explain that.
I think architecture historically was a rich man's son's profession. You know, if you look at how it filtered down, that, you know, it's basically looking at an opportunity to design something that's well funded. But we have a lot more work to do where we're not just designing buildings, we're figuring out how to, our biggest problem is home. Our biggest problem is housing. We see it when we go down the street. So that means there's something wrong, or we're not producing the products innovatively in terms of housing, in terms of community development, so that we don't have a housing problem. The other part of the equation is codes, zonings, and politicians passing laws that they haven't thought about. For example, the Surplus Land Act, meaning a government agency has to give first rights of the land to a nonprofit developer to build houses. That's a good thing, but did you think it all the way through in terms of, does that limit us in terms of nurturing development in other areas? Yes, it does, right? So the county can't buy land and now do what I'm proposing to do, because if they buy land, they have to get it ready for nonprofits. Well, imagine how long that's going to slow down the process of bringing houses to the market. So I think architecture should start creating more than just design of buildings, start teaching economic development as a component of it. And I think that would allow a lot more creative juices.
Having said that, just to go right back to I think it was almost the very first slide, it was your family member who was an architect who built the house.
Mm-hmm.
Say again?
Charles Fleming. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful, beautiful house. I mean, that was like pure architecture. Just tell us a little bit more about Charles Fleming and that house.
Charles, so that's a 1970 house. When I first saw that house, that was before I saw Sea Ranch, right? So it's basically—
I saw it and I thought Sea Ranch.
Right, because when I saw it, I was like, when I learned about Sea Ranch, I was like, oh, that's what Charles wants. Because it's all redwood and he's never painted it. So, but he was a gentleman who worked for a demolition company when he was a kid. And then in school, a teacher taught him how to draw by hand. And he's got some beautiful paintings. And once he got past that confidence of painting, then he just started drawing houses. And actually, Charles started designing houses, I think, as early as 17, 18 years old. And they're very much Frank Lloyd Wright type, and started designing them in all these communities and things. And so for me, when I was a kid, his office, I could see from my bedroom in Laclede Town, because it was across this field, I could see him go to work. And I thought he was cool. He got a beautiful wife, beautiful car. He got all these people going into his office. And in 1970, he had this big old tub that was like 5 by 6. And to me, that was like James Bond or something. So he was kind of like my role model of, I want to be like him, right? But at the same time, the other part of me was like, I want to make buildings that make our communities better places, because the communities I grew up in were all dying. In Jamaica, Queens, they were dying. In St. Louis, they were dying. Every place that was great, you know, you were watching them get torn down. And I thought I wanted to emulate him. And then when he built Martin Luther King Hospital, I was just like, he was in Ebony magazine. That's like the Black magazine. It's like Life magazine at that time. And I was just blown away with what he was doing, but I was also blown away that he was making changes in our communities and so forth. So yeah, that was a role model. And that's what I want for kids. I want kids in Black and brown communities to see people more like us creating things so that they can say, I want to be like that person.
You started this journey late 80s. You then really dove into the Crenshaw issues after the riots, 1992 civil unrest. It was a different mood in the Crenshaw district then. Do you think it's changed? Do you think it's looking up? Do you think if you were to go to the folks in power now with the kinds of ideas that you had back then, do you think that you'd have more traction?
I don't know. I really don't know. Because one of the challenges you see, Crenshaw still has a few loud voices interfering with economic development. And that's terrible. I think a colleague of mine, and they wanted to buy the Crenshaw Mall, and you have this great item you look at, and so some of you may not know, IKEA, one of the first sites by IKEA to come to Southern California was considering Santa Barbara Plaza. And this is way back in the 80s. And the community was yelling, we don't want trucks in the community. You know how many people wish they had took IKEA now, right? So, but that community's always had young voices. I think a combination of fear of change, and it's unfortunate. And I just think some of those voices are still effective in being loud, and politicians surrender to that. Again, that's why I kind of like praise Mayor Butts, because he wouldn't surrender to that. But I think, I think it's still challenging. I'm tired now, so I've kind of moved on to something different. This takes too much energy, and unless you're making money, it's not worth it. I hate to say it, but and that's sad, because that's what really holds back progress in a lot of Black and brown communities, fear of change. But it also has roots in being exploited in the past. So that the exploitations in the past really have made that almost like concrete. But I think political leadership needs to get it together, especially now while you got a president that's like, I'm ready for ideas. So people need to come up with ideas. So, but to answer your question, I don't have the energy to go back into that. I'm gonna stay on this path that I'm on right now.
The path on the housing equity path, and all the architectural work that you are doing with the firm, because you have your
Right. Yeah.
day job.
Right. And it's funny, you get older, I can't draw anymore. My team members are like, don't touch the CAD drawing. So it's like, and I'm scared to touch it, but I just hate it when somebody says, can you give me that drawing? I'm like, oh yeah. But I like architecture, but I really want to switch more into influencing community economic development based on what I learned.
Yeah, Michael, this has really been fantastic. Francis, maybe we're going to run out of time in about 6 minutes.
No, it's fine. No, it's totally fine. Off you go, Steve. Can I say thank you to Michael and then hand?
Oh no, we're not going to. Now let's just have Gabriel has a question. Let's just have him, and then we can keep going for a few minutes. Wanted to ask your question real quick.
Let's go.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, for giving this presentation. It's really awesome to see. When you get the loans, does your company act as a developer for the project, or is there another developer? And if your company does act as a developer, how much more freedom or control do you have over the execution of the project?
So, Gabriel, I have no interest in being a developer. I'm switching. My purpose is I want to try to make it happen large in a lot. So I'm really trying to participate around land assembly, entitling it to make possible for any developer to build it, right? Because we need 600,000 units of housing. We have to figure out a different process that really comes down to, when you don't have a redevelopment agency, how are we going to come up with a public-private partnership that makes it possible to assemble land, right, at the scale that we need? When I built Leimert Park Homes, we needed 120,000, 180,000 houses at that time. That was 30 years ago. Now we're doing great. We're up to 600,000. And California is going to need 3.8 million. So if we figure it out, we create a great business opportunity. So no, but I'm not a developer. I'm not interested in development. I just help with the financial transactions, but I basically get all the experts in those areas to come a part of the team. I'm not trying to do anything I don't know. But you can always, when it comes to money, you can find people that know how to do things. But they just got to be transparent. That's the only thing I emphasize. We've got to be transparent. We got to figure this out, how to get right. No hidden agendas. And when people get equity home ownership, they got to go through some process of learning so that they don't get taken advantage of by predatory lenders after they get a triplex. Because you get a triplex 7 years down the line, somebody come in and I can refinance your house or change your windows and make it better. And next thing you know, you got a lien on you and they're jacking up your property. So those things I'm concerned about. Next.
Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, this has been really, really fantastic. I mean, your life's effort and work and accomplishments in aiming at a territory and thinking so beyond 99.9% of the population of even our own industry, right? that we don't, you use the word lobby, and I just wonder what you mean ultimately, because I'm not a politician and I'm not that political, but clearly you're capable and figured out a way to ask for things and to initiate ideas. I think this a really fantastic concept of trying to really build equity into communities and society is just really, really provocative and thoughtful. And I just think it's great that you're actually trying to do it. You know, I wouldn't even know where to begin. And then you just, maybe you can talk about what you even mean by lobbying. I don't know if any of us really,
So I got
I
that
mean, you're
word
talking to
lobby.
major people.
It comes in, you know, you heard lobbying all about how politicians and banks get policies changed and so forth. But really, the reason I put the ideas out there is to get the community to start to raise the voice in these words. Because politicians, when it comes time to get elected, that's when they're listening, right? So my purpose of often putting ideas out is to get a choir to sing this song of this is how we can do it, right? And let's do it, right? So we have to figure out a way how society, our societies, our communities are constantly reinventing or adjusting themselves to the next level of life. And I think that will make life better for everyone. Because when you get a pandemic, you need money to figure out how you're going to resolve it. So, you know, so it comes down to money. If you don't have money, you can't do anything. Right? So how do we make it work where it's mutually beneficial? I don't think there should be poverty. I mean, I shouldn't say I don't think. It doesn't need to exist if you really were proactive about it. And then we all win. So.
Well, fantastic.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, it's great. And I do count on the fact that you're going to get this to work. So
I will, but I still have to ask you a question. Can somebody do an economic analysis? So
I don't know. I know I couldn't. I don't know if any of we certainly there are real estate departments and there's economic knowledge base, but I don't know.
Okay.
But Michael's point is, just to wrap, because we've got 2 minutes left, but Michael's point is that one, architects need to be thinking a bit more like this themselves. But also, Michael has worn many hats. You said a moment ago, I'm not a developer. I don't want to be a developer. However, you're still thinking conceptually like a developer. And so I guess that's the thing as well, is that does the way development works, is there a space for a person like you who is architect and thinking like a developer and a bit of an economist? You're bringing these different skill sets. Sort of, does the door open to that, or do people say stay in your lane? You know, your lane is architecture, stay there. Or
let me say this real quick. I think students, one thing I would try to encourage you, get a hybrid education. So architecture, urban economics, urban planning, start looking at hybrid knowledge. UC Merced does these hybrid degrees because then you can be flexible based on the changes as they come. So I'll kind of leave it with that. That's my thought. And I'm definitely some hybrid, something's wrong up there. So, you know, I'm just sort of spacey, so that kind of helps create a lot of things. But thank you all very much. I really
thank you.
it.
Great lecture, great work.
Well, you all kind of have, I feel like I'm singing to the right audience. So.
Now we're very interested. It's really, really provocative.
Okay. Good luck, kids. Good luck.
Hey, and thank you, Francis. You were terrific. Great moderation and questions. So thank you for being here with us too.
It's been my pleasure. My pleasure. Great to see you all, and hope you all found it interesting and inspiring, and you'll go off and get a hybrid architectural education.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Great.
Good.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We'll invite you for sure.
Right.
Okay.
Good.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.